Hi Bio 111 students, and welcome to week 7, and today we're doing chapter 7, Cellular Respiration. And one of the reactions that we would have to understand if we were talking about this subject is we have to understand the reduction oxidation reaction, otherwise known as the redox reaction. So I'm going to give you an example of one, and I'm going to give you some definitions. So we have RH. This will be our reducing agent. And I'm going to define reducing agent. It is the electron donor. So in this reaction, this is giving the electrons to this one, and therefore this one will be reduced by receiving the electrons. So the next part, the NAD+, we call that the oxidizing agent. So it is an electron acceptor. So what we would say that this one is reduced and this one is oxidized. And this is the oxidizing agent, and this is the reducing agent. And this reaction is called a redox reaction because reducing and oxidation are occurring at the same time in this reaction, so it is called a redox reaction. And as you'll see later, this is one of the reactions that takes place during cellular respiration. So, glucose metabolism breaking down of glucose gets us ATP energy. There are two ways of getting this. One is aerobic. Oxygen present. The other one is anaerobic. And oxygen is not present. Our body's cells and the cells of other organisms can perform both of these reactions, but the preferable one is aerobic because with oxygen present, we have a better pathway to produce ATP. So now let's look at the amount of ATP produced for anaerobic. It is 2 ATPs worth of energy, and for aerobic it's 36 to 38. There's some argument about this final number of ATPs for aerobic. Even the lowest estimate is about 32, which is a lot better than 2. So that's really what we need to know in this class, is that aerobic produces 36 to 38 ATPs, and anaerobic, there's no dispute about that one. It is only 2 ATPs. So still talking about glucose metabolism, there are 2 pathways. And as we said before, aerobic and anaerobic. And let's look at some of the differences. Between these 2 pathways. One is oxygen need. Oxygen is necessary for the aerobic pathway. It is not necessary for the anaerobic pathway. And the types of organisms that do the 2 pathways differ too. For instance, archaea, which are the world's most ancient microorganisms, and a lot of bacteria, plus some fungi, are anaerobic. And they're anaerobic, sometimes only anaerobic. So the ATP generation, as we talked about before, is 2 ATP for these guys. Now, one of the things that I'd like to say about this also is that this was originally the way that life dealt with glucose metabolism before, because it is a much more highly evolved characteristic to be able to do aerobic respiration, because we know that an oxygen depleted Earth, which is what this guy would have had, only give him a chance. The only choice he had, really, the archaea, the only choice they had was anaerobic respiration. So that's the original, and that's the oldest form of glucose metabolism that went on. So let's get started on cellular metabolism, the first step. So the very first step of glucose metabolism is called glycolysis. And we see this lysis, it comes up in biology quite a lot. Lysis means splitting apart. So what's going to happen to our glucose molecule is it will be split apart. So we see C6H12O6 glucose will become two C3H4O3 C3 molecules. And another product of that will be that we will get 2 ATP. This is called pyruvate, just so everyone is clear. 2 ATP net, and also we will have 2 NADHs. So if you were counting the H's, you would notice that we would have 8 over here. We started off with 12, so obviously we have to account for the rest of those hydrogens, and that's where they ended up. And the net of 2 ATP, I'm saying the word net because 2 ATP are needed to start this reaction, and what we get out of it is 4 ATP. So 4 minus 2 gives us a net of 2 ATP. So, in the absence of oxygen in our own muscle cells, we can do anaerobic respiration. If any of you have ever had cramped muscles, it's likely as a result of doing some anaerobic respiration. And people will talk about lactic acid buildup on your muscles or lactate buildup, and that is this reaction here, and it's called lactate fermentation. And so again, we start off with our C6H12O6 glucose, and we get our pyruvate, which is we get 2 pyruvates. Each one of them is going to be a C3H8O3, and those 2 pyruvates each become two lactic acids plus 2 ATPs, because again we got these 2 pyruvates and that gave us a net of 2 ATPs, because glycolysis occurred between here and here, and because we don't have oxygen, we're going to go straight into producing lactate or lactic acid, and that is 2CH3 HOH CO2H. And so the products of this reaction are, we get 2 ATPs instead of the 36 to 38, and we have lactic acid as a byproduct, and buildup of lactic acid is what causes that crampy feeling in your muscles. And you'll notice as well about lactic acid, it has 3 carbons. There's another kind of fermentation also that happens inside cells, and this is alcohol fermentation. And typically this will occur with yeast cells. Which are a kind of fungi. So again, we start off with our C6H12O6. We get 2 pyruvates, C2H8 or 8 C3H4O3, and so we get from that we get ethanol, which is more commonly known as alcohol, and we get two of those. So that's C2H5, and here's the all group, the OH, and again we get 2 CO2, and because of this step here we got 2 ATPs from it. So with any fermentation, again, it's an anaerobic reaction, you're only going to get 2 ATPs. So, cellular respiration creates ATP. So we have pyruvate. By the way, glycolysis happens in the cytosol of the cell, or the cytoplasm you might call it, of the cell, not inside the mitochondria. But pyruvate, the 3-carbon things I was talking about earlier, will enter the mitochondria and it is converted first into a thing called acetyl CoA, and once it becomes acetyl CoA, we have some production of stuff here, and what happens is we get CO2 released, and an NADH is produced. And NADH is an important molecule that we'll be talking about a little bit later. You'll see the value of these in a few minutes. Citric acid cycle. It enters this, you'll see in your books and things like that, a cycle that looks like this, goes around, and it continues on. And this, not too long ago, was known as the Krebs cycle, after a guy called Werner Krebs, who discovered it with a guy called Benson. And now it's called citric acid cycle, so RCAC. And what happens is that we get 2 more ATP, but more importantly, it produces 8 NADH, and 2 FADH2, and 6 CO2. CO2 is a waste product, we're not going to use that, but waste product of cellular respiration is CO2. So the next stage that all of this stuff enters into is called the electron transport chain. So all of these molecules except the CO2 are energy transporting molecules, so they're bringing energy with them. And at the start of the electron transport chain, we're pretty high in energy, and as we go down through the electron transport chain, energy is lost and ATP is produced. So we'll see a thing called ATP synthase. And what happens there is that as each proton from one of these guys, each of these protons passes through ATP synthase, we have a reaction that makes ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, which is it's got 2 phosphates, not 3, and it makes each hydrogen passing through the ATP synthase converts ADP into ATP. So we're getting a lot of ATP out of this cycle, and we're going to talk about the totals of ATP later, but we basically get nearly all of the ATP produced within the electron transport chain. It is 32 to 34 of the total of 36 to 8. 36 to 38 are produced in the electron transport chain. And we have a couple of carrier proteins that we need to make note of here. Within the ETC, electron transport chain, carrier proteins, which allow ATP to be produced. We have ubiquinone, and we also have cytochrome C. And just so we realize it, let's get the totals. Total glucose, or total ATP, and with the ETC it is 32 to 34. And for the citric acid cycle, and that's that wheel that I showed you earlier, it's just 2. And glycolysis, when you split that glucose into 2 pyruvates, you just get 2 ATPs. So the electron transport chain is the big producer of ATP in our bodies. And one more thing that you should know is that in order for the electron transport chain to work, there needs to be an oxygen at the end that accepts the electrons that are left over from all of the reactions that take place, and also to deal with the hydrogens that have been released. And so what happens is a H2O, when you get 2 hydrogens binding to each of those oxygens, is a waste product of cellular metabolism, or glucose metabolism, and another one is CO2. Do know that oxygen is the final electron acceptor in glucose metabolism or cellular respiration. So cellular respiration can use other energy sources besides glucose. And so we have protein metabolism, and It's not as efficient as the carbohydrate metabolism. One of the reasons for this is because ammonia is a waste product. And you break down all of each of the proteins has to be broken down into amino acids first, and that takes a little bit of energy too. Because amino acids are the digestible parts of the protein. The other one that we can do is lipid metabolism. Lipid metabolism is more profitable for our body because lipids are very energy dense, and they're even more energy dense than glucose. So an example of a lipid that we could break down would be some of our triglycerides. So in a situation where glucose isn't available to our body, we can break these down too. And that's really what we need to know for Chapter 7 and cellular respiration. Thank you.